All right, everybody, thanks for joining today. My name is Brian Anderson, VP of Technology. Got some other guys here on the panel today as well. We've got Dustin Paglia. He's a pre-sales engineer out of St. Louis, and he also does quite a bit in the Microsoft Defender space. So if we get into some Q&A, he's going to help us with the Stump the Chump. You want to say hi, Dustin?
Hey.
And then the star of the show, we've got Adam Svoboda. He heads up our cybersecurity practice and is one heck of a pen tester and one of the chillest dudes I know. We were joking earlier that he's the Big Lebowski version of cybersecurity dude. so today we're going to talk about, oh, sorry, Adam, I didn't get a chance to say hi. So today, Adam's going to go over endpoint detection and response. He's going to break it down how it works, and he's even going to show you some interesting ways to bypass it. All right. So you guys have seen this slide before. I'll be brief on some of this. Eagle is an engineering-led company. It's been owned by the same 3 engineers for the last 42 years. It's also 3/4 staffed by engineers. So while we work with a lot of the big name vendors, the Dells and the HPEs of the world, we are not a la carte like most of our competitors, right? We don't sell everything they offer. Our owners encourage us to go out and find the best solution to solve a problem. A big part of that due diligence is performing long products. You can see the 4 tenets over there on the left we look for during a POC. Really, the last item is timely for today's discussion, and that's business outcomes. For an EDR product, that means does the solution risk and provide expert assistance with items like remediation and threat hunting, which is something we're going to talk more about today. And that really leads me to my final point. Adam and the rest of the team has spent over 5 years EDR solutions at this point, and one problem persists with all of them, and that is staffing. So we will either find a really excellent product, but for it to truly be successful, you would need a security operations center with 5 to 7 people, or we see managed products that really struggle as they begin to scale, right? And we've all seen support struggle at scale. So none of this works well for the average medium-sized business, and that's really the most of our customers fit into that bucket. And so this issue is so prevalent in this space that Eagle is evaluating our own managed security offerings to help our customers. We already offer pen testing, that's managed by Adam's team, but we want to do more to help customers in this space. So stay tuned for a little taste of that toward the end of today's presentation. In the interim, you're going to see much of that Eagle engineering prowess and due diligence on display today as Adam breaks down what an EDR is.
Quick introduction slide for everybody. My name is Adam Svoboda. I've been at Eagle, I think going on 8, maybe 9 years now. And my job primarily is the principal cybersecurity strategist. So, coming up with strategies and plans to help grow our cybersecurity business model. And a large part of that right now, and what I spend a lot of my time on, is penetration testing. So in my free time right now, I'm learning a lot about malware development and analysis. Reverse engineering, of course, that kind of incorporates EDR evasion, and then looking more at the threat hunting piece of the puzzle, so kind of the blue team and defensive side. So to set things off, let's take a look at a high-level abstraction explaining the differences between what we view as traditional antivirus and EDR products. So if you look up at the top in the orange flowchart, you can see that typically antivirus has focused on identifying malicious code prior to execution by heavily relying on heuristics and signatures. So this could include malware living within a file on disk or within memory, typically detected using file hashes such as MD5 or SHA-1 or byte patterns within that memory. And the lines are a bit blurred today as AV products can subscribe to some of the same telemetry feeds as the EDR products, but this is a focus on the traditional understanding of the difference and why there was a need to invent a new product or acronym to describe the evolution of endpoint threat detection. So you can see on the slide here, typically antivirus would look at a process or a binary, rather a binary before execution. run it through some heuristic analysis to detect any sort of signatures, and then, respond accordingly. So if something was detected, quarantine, delete; if not, allow. EDR, which is short for endpoint detection and response, does before execution analysis. It uses this traditional AV workflow, but it also focuses heavily on the after execution analysis. So as a process is running, it's continuously analyzing its behavior through a variety of methods that it can subscribe to. So, it can hook API calls, kernel callbacks, artificial intelligence, all sorts of things. And continuously, it's going to record telemetry on everything that process is doing and push it to its cloud portal or its, your local SIM, however you have that set up. And then it's capable of responding in a little bit more granular way, where it can actually block specific behaviors in real time and understand better what the program is doing in real time if it can't rely on a static signature detection. I'm going to speed through this slide here really quickly, but I wanted to give some examples of traditional IOC detection. IOC is short for indicators of compromise, and those are just breadcrumbs that threat hunters can look for to recognize, machine may be compromised by malicious code. So traditionally, there's been kind of three major methods of detecting IOCs. One is a sandbox, which you'll find in a lot of traditional antivirus products as well as EDRs. And sandboxing actually runs the process that you execute in a local emulator that tries to look for malicious behavior within the first few seconds of running the process. So it's going to check for common things like if the process is opening a handle to another process, trying to allocate memory, inject code in that process, things like that. So sandboxing is really big these days, but sandboxing doesn't run for long because it blocks the execution of the process while it's sandboxing it. So typically, you can bypass some of these sandboxes by doing things such as calculating prime numbers for like 10 seconds and really using a lot of CPU. And it causes these sandboxes to sort of time out and just pass execution back to the original file. That's just one example. It doesn't work on every sandbox, but they can be bypassed with a variety of methods. And then second is signature detection. So kind of, I think, what everyone's familiar with, looking at file hashes, things such as Yara or Sigma rules, which are really valuable for detecting IOCs within a binary. And also the entropy of the file. So if the file is packed or obfuscated in some way, it doesn't resemble a normal file, high levels of entropy can also trip some of those detections. And then finally, memory scanning is a big piece of traditional IOC detection because a lot of malware these days is fileless, which means it doesn't really need to live on disk or exist on disk at all. It stays within the memory and it just injects code and spawns into or moves into other remote processes. So there's not a static file on disk that can necessarily always be traced back to what's running in memory. So certain antivirus and ADR engines will look at pages within a process's memory that are marked as executable, which means they contain code that the operating system can execute. And if it's executable, it could be malicious, so they will scan those for known IOCs. There's bypasses, of course, for all of these methods, but these are just some traditional methods for IOC detection I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. So now we can talk about EDR architecture. And I kind of started off with a little bit of a joke slide to show you, kind of poke fun at what you might see in a marketing presentation from these EDR products. A lot of them focus on the fact that they have a kernel driver and it's in the kernel, so they can't be touched, they can't be tampered with, anything like that. And as we kind of peel back the curtains, you can see some of the components that make these up, and I will go over those. So there's usually a kernel driver that sometimes, if it's a pretty well-known EDR product, it has what's called an ELAM driver. ELAM stands for Early Launch Anti-Malware, and that actually requires an approval from Microsoft with a valid code signature, which allows that driver to be loaded very early on in the boot process. So it can, execute before a lot of other code on the system, which is really important for protecting the integrity of an anti-malware application. The kernel drivers will also implement things such as kernel callbacks and ETWTI. This stands for Event Tracing for Windows Threat Intelligence. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, so I won't focus too much on it now. And then, of course, your typical network and file system filter drivers. So the driver is going to monitor the traffic being transmitted, in and out of the network on the endpoint, as well as all file system activity. Then you have your agent processes. These are in ring 3, which is known as user mode, and ring 0 is kernel mode. So there's the boundary of separation between these two. And the agent processes communicate to and from the kernel drivers. So kernel level telemetry flows down into the agent processes, and then telemetry from all of the events that the agent processes subscribe to also get orchestrated through that. So one important thing to note is that when you have an ELAM driver, an early launch anti-malware driver, you can spawn a process on Windows that's known as a PPL process. PPL stands for Protected Process Light. And this is just a method of protecting a process on Windows where it can't be opened or terminated by any other low privilege process on the system. So these are built-in protection methods to keep the integrity of the EDR product alive and isolated from being tampered with. You typically have your cloud portal, which lets you do things like analysis and queries on all of your collected telemetry. Cool stuff like threat hunting, which is an absolute must, where you can make proactive queries to look at your telemetry and check for any known indicators of compromise, both proactively and retroactively. You have the analysis engines, which look at the static and memory signatures. They also do the sandboxing. And then kind of the meat and the potatoes of the EDR is the real-time piece of that, right? So you have your behavioral analysis and the artificial intelligence. And that's where you are looking at behaviors, running them through a local model, local classifier. These are usually trained on GBDT models, which stands for gradient-based decision trees. And you can kind of Google GBDT antivirus and find a lot of information about why they pick that particular type of classifier and why it's really good for identifying some malicious behavior. And then your behavioral analysis engines look at kind of the order of operations. So what is the process doing and what order is it doing it in, right? And then they like to map that back to MITRE attack techniques that help detect and identify certain techniques or sub-techniques of malicious behavior, as well as a custom rule set that they will employ. Some other components would include network filter drivers that run in the kernel, file system mini filter drivers, additional anti-tampering behavior. So in addition to ELAM and PPL, they may implement some sort of monitoring on the process. So if an exploit is performed to kill that process, it can be respawned. A lot of EDRs also use user mode API hooking. They have what's called an AMSI provider. This stands for Anti-Malware Scan Interface, and it is an abstraction available by Microsoft that allows you to scan on the fly certain types of code that run. Typically, you'll see this commonly used in PowerShell. A lot of the strings and code you execute in PowerShell will first pass through that AMSI provider to be scanned. A lot of EDRs also have LAN device discovery, so they will crawl your local network for devices, and that just helps you with onboarding and understanding what's out there on the network, what might be a rogue device, and what you need to worry about. And then when you kind of move into the cloud side of things, there's SOAR, security orchestration, and automated response. A lot of EDR playbooks will help you build these automated response or remediation actions that look at rules in the cloud and then apply them based on what's detected. And many EDR products For example, CrowdStrike has Falcon Overwatch, which will do hands-on sample analysis and manage threat hunting for you. So those are bolt-on pieces that, of course, cost more money. But this is typically a collection of common components that you will find in an EDR product. So before we dive in, I want to clarify what I mean when I say detection. So when I say something is detected by an EDR product, I mean, the EDR product is purchased, updated, installed on an endpoint, and some sort of action is detected out of the box, right? So you're not making any sort of custom rules. These are default detections built into the EDR product as sort of a baseline. And EDR products, they can generate a lot of false positives. So these out-of-the-box detections generally only pop if they are highly confident that the behavior is malicious. And a lot of these behaviors, since they rely on that high confidence, they have a few blind spots that are commonly abused by bad actors. So it's actually not too difficult sometimes to avoid these built-in out-of-the-box alerts. However, as we will see, the EDR will still collect the telemetry on the malicious action. You just won't see an alert generated. So that's why it's really important to look at that threat hunting piece and make sure you have someone or some sort of managed service going through your portal and looking at your telemetry. So poking a little bit of fun here, we're going to talk about MITRE attack, and Elastic kind of put it best here. MITRE attack is not a measuring stick, it's a knowledge base. So trying to use that as a universal quantitative measurement of a device is a recipe for failure. So you see a lot of EDR marketing presentations brag about having 100% MITRE attack coverage. They'll say they detect and block zero-day attacks with sophisticated AI running on a very lightweight agent that only uses 1% of your CPU, et cetera, et cetera. And, none of this is necessarily a lie or, said in bad faith. I think people just tend to focus on the wrong things. So having 100% MITRE attack coverage is a fantastic feature, but it's important to understand the difference between being able to tag everything with a MITRE technique versus an actual threat. So, here, if we said there was a tactic to discover a fire extinguisher, right? The identification of a fire extinguisher doesn't indicate a fire is burning nearby. So 100% MITRE coverage doesn't mean, detection of malicious threats. These are just things to help blue teams and threat hunters classify and understand techniques. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So when you're purchasing or looking at an EDR product, you're probably going to see that 100% MITRE attack coverage, and they will brag about how they tested really well on MITRE by using some testing frameworks and scripts that automate some of these attack kill chains. So it's really important to note that these attack simulation frameworks are not really accurate indicators of your EDR's detection capabilities. I recommend all the time to clients that if they want to do some testing and tighten up their detections, to look into tools such as Atomic Red Team, Prelude, MITRE has Caldera, there's Vector, Attack IQ. I mean, there's 10 or 20 others I could list here, right? And what these tools do is they emulate in order, typically, an attack kill chain or specific tactics used by threat actors. So with Prelude, which is my personal favorite, you can emulate an entire attack kill chain from a ransomware actor such as Conti, and it's based off of analysis and real world analysis of that kill chain. So you're getting a super accurate simulation. The problem is that when you automate these entire attack kill chains execute in a matter of seconds or minutes. So in real world scenarios, if you're hit by a ransomware attack, it can take, up to in excess of 200 days sometimes before threat hunters or can understand that you've been compromised or before there's any indication of compromise. Bad actors can live for several months in your organization, and they will slowly move through this kill chain. So on the bottom here, day one, the attacker is going to start off with some reconnaissance, probably take a few days before they figure out something they can weaponize and deliver to you. And then based on what's in your organization, they will exploit it in a curated way, a custom way, and then attack on their objectives. So I have day 30 here. Usually it's, 3 months or so. But when you run these tools, right, you're condensing all of that into 5 minutes. And it's a lot easier for an EDR to trigger a detection on telemetry that's dense and compact, because a lot of the detection rules are context sensitive. And this kind of leads to better detection rates on those out-of-box alerts. So they test really well, but in real-world scenarios where the timeline's stretched out, you start to lose context, and they don't always perform as well as what you'll see in the marketing material. So quick warning here. Oh, sorry, Ryan.
So Adam, I hate to interrupt you, but just to make sure I understand that. So you're saying that if they just wait long enough between the different parts of, the MITRE attack framework, that they can basically evade detection?
It's not always as simple as that, but order of operations are important for some of the out-of-the-box detection rates. And by stretching out the timeline and performing things in a little bit different orders, taking a lot of time between certain OPSEC unsafe activities on the endpoint, you can definitely, see a reduction in the success of those out-of-the-box detection rates. It's a lot more difficult for an EDR to trigger one of those alerts when the context-sensitive information that they need to highly and confidently pop that alert is stretched out over a period of time. So, when it's all condensed in that 5-minute attack sim, it's a lot easier to trigger those with a higher confidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Perfect. Just caution everyone, we're leaving dark mode here for a second. I have some bright white slides. Wanted to talk about MITRE a little bit more. So like we said, it's a knowledge base that provides descriptions, examples, and detections. One MITRE tactic or technique rather that I wanted to highlight here is process injection. And this is used by bad actors to run malicious code within another process. So MITRE maps this to T1055, and EDR products will collect telemetry from a variety of sources to identify techniques such as this one right here. Threat hunters can then log into the EDR portal and use those identified techniques as a starting point for hunting investigations and mapping timelines of attack kill chains. I'm focusing on process injection because it's commonly performed by a lot of red teaming tools or apt groups, ransomware actors, etc., after initial access, or even implemented within some of the stage 0 payloads that they will execute. So many red teams and app groups will leverage tools like Cobalt Strike to execute code in remote processes, either by leveraging the built-in malleable C2 profiles or some custom loaders. So you will see a lot of malware likes to use process injection, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And Windows provides a plethora of ways to inject code into another process. Here's some common API calls you can use. Create remote thread is sort of the classic, well-known one. And then there's QUser APC, which can get past, I would say, more detections than create remote thread, at least in the current metagame. I want to bring some attention to the Elastic MITRE evaluation. They did a round 4, I think, back in April of this year. And what they did is they took all of the most popular EDR products and they ran them through a bunch of testing to see how successful they were at mapping their behaviors to MITRE attack techniques. And that's kind of where you get that marketing mantra about the 100% MITRE coverage. It's really important to EDR vendors that they can map to a lot of those techniques as they help the threat hunters. So where do EDRs get all of their data from? most of their data, comes from monitoring process creation. And these are events that can be propagated from subscribing to callbacks within the Windows kernel. They can also look at things like event tracing for Windows and API hooking, things like that. So there's multiple avenues that EDR products take to get each piece of this telemetry. File creation, that can be monitored through a mini filter driver, kernel callbacks, API hooking, event tracing. There's a lot of methods for collecting these individual bits of telemetry, but you will see when it comes to mapping malicious behavior to a technique, these are how the flows of telemetry kind of break up. So the process injection technique T1055, if you look at the detection heat map for a lot of the big products out of the box, you'll find it looks quite suspicious, right? Don't see a lot of detection there. There's quite a big blind spot in a lot of process injection mapping to that MITRE technique. So this doesn't necessarily imply that the EDR is unsuccessful at popping an out-of-the-box alert for detection, but if it can't manage to map that to the MITRE technique a good percentage of the time, it's questionable, right? It makes you wonder. So there's a lot of these techniques that are widely used, but you'll see in this analysis that there's pretty big blind spots in mapping those techniques. So one of the first detection mechanisms implemented by a lot of EDR products is event tracing for Windows, and this is ETW for short. And it was first introduced in Windows 2000 as a method to provide verbose user and kernel level logging to different applications. Processes can trace different ETW providers to obtain different information about activity within the file system, the network, registry, processes, threads, etc. So the original use case, I think, was actually for application debugging and optimization, but it's turned into a widely used feature for collecting event telemetry on the operating system. If you guys use Sysmon, or you've heard of Sysmon by sysinternals, it is a heavy user of ETW events to populate that event log. So it's kind of broken up into three pieces. You have your controllers that orchestrate these tracing sessions and the providers. And then the providers, for different things such as network events or the .NET runtime, CLR load events, things like that, emit these events that can be traced, and then your consumers subscribe or trace these events from the provider. So an EDR would be a consumer of ETW events, for example. The evolution of ETW in usage by EDR products kind of took off when Microsoft created what is called ETW TI. And that is a provider called Microsoft Windows Threat Intelligence. And they originally created this to bolster the Defender detection capabilities. And they kind of wanted it to be secret in a way. They don't want just anybody to be able to subscribe to this event feed because it emits a plethora of valuable telemetry around API calls that are commonly abused by malicious code. So, you see here if a process tries to allocate virtual memory, change the protection of a virtual of memory's permissions, if it tries to write memory, read memory, create threads, anything like that. A lot of those calls are used in process injection and identifying that T1055 MITRE tactic. This stuff is all really good to look at. So I think any EDR worth its salt these days is subscribing to this TI feed. If your vendor is not, I would probably ask them why not and see if they can implement that, because this has really made it a lot more difficult on threat actors to get malicious behavior past the telemetry. So again, this doesn't necessarily help the out-of-the-box detection rate, but it just makes sure that you have a log of all of this stuff somewhere. So if you do get popped, or if you're doing threat hunting, you can track down and figure out what exactly is going on here. This is limited to ELAM driver security vendors, so you can only subscribe to this ETWTI provider if you are a PPL process spawned by an ELAM driver. So a lot of, most of the big EDR vendors have this, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, etc. But there's some other vendors out there who may have not implemented this yet. They may not have an ELAM driver. And that's something I think they should be prioritizing, because this is really an easy win for a lot of that telemetry. When it comes to event tracing for Windows, kind of back in 2017, this was a really popular tweet at the time. And Des, he's the lead of security for Elastic right now. He provided some example code. So there's a few layers of event tracing for Windows. TI, this again, you have to be a PPL process spawned by an ELAM driver to access it. So there's not really an easy way to bypass a kernel, an ELAM driver with the PPL process subscribe to this from getting your telemetry without having kernel read-write privileges, right? Which you really can only get if you load an unsigned driver or abuse a known vulnerable driver in Windows, or have some sort of 0-day, you're fortunate enough to burn to get kernel read-write from a low privilege user. So the other piece of ETW is sort of the user mode logging, right? The stuff that anyone can subscribe to. And since that exists within user mode, your malicious code also runs in user mode, and user mode processes in Windows can generally mess with the memory or the contents of other user mode processes. So the idea here is you can get the function address of this ETW event write call, which is part of NTDLL. It's an API that ultimately emits the events your process makes to the ETW provider that people can consume. And you just take that function address, you change the memory permissions to make it writable, and then you change the contents so the function just returns immediately, right? Or in this case, return 14 for 32-bit architecture. And so when your process generates events, it's going to call the ETW event write function, but you've patched it in memory to instantly return. So it just returns, your process is none the wiser, and none of the events that your process generates actually make it to the consumers. So this is a way to blind one form of EDR telemetry that comes from user mode ETW. I was going to say it is possible for EDR products to detect that this is happening by simply reading the process memory, getting that process address themselves and checking to see if it's been patched to return. And there are some EDR products that I believe do detect that behavior. During my testing, it was actually quite shocking that there's at least one major EDR player that, you can have its out of the box code injection alert silenced if you just simply patch user mode ETW, even though it still subscribes to ETW-TI, which gets all the information it needs to know that a process injection has occurred. For whatever reason, its out-of-the-box detection was kind of heavily reliant on having a piece of that user mode ETW functionality implemented. So you'll see that even though EDRs do detect telemetry and duplicate telemetry from multiple sources, sometimes their detection engineering teams might rely on one particular source more than another, sometimes incorrectly. And those are all things that, as bad actors or penetration testers, we can abuse and bypass. And here's a quick overview of sort of all of the possible attacks on ETW, right? So you have your EDRs that subscribe to these different feeds, and your user mode process here that writes to the different feeds, which you can patch out. And it's possible, if you've got a hold of a legitimate code signing certificate or a vulnerable driver, or if you can put Windows in test sign mode and load an unsigned driver, which should be a massive red flag, that you can tamper with the ETW-TI events, as these are all in the kernel. That's not really too common. So even the EDR I talked about that I could evade a certain alert with this, they still had that telemetry in the cloud portal thanks to ETWTI, and it could still query it on and identify that something happened. Just out of the box, the alert did not fire. Another primary detection mechanism that EDRs will use is the subscription to a variety of kernel callbacks that can notify on all sorts of low-level events. So every major EDR product has one or more kernel drivers that they typically leverage to subscribe to a variety of callbacks. And these callbacks allow the EDR to be notified directly by the kernel when certain things happen, such as a new process or thread is created, or an image has been loaded, such as an exe file or a DLL. If a bad actor has kernel read-write already, which, again, this is typically uncommon, they could simply enumerate the routines in the kernel and then remove the callback, linked to a known EDR driver, which could be identified by checking the digital signature on that driver for an EDR company name, like CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Microsoft, etc. So there are many kernel callbacks we're not going to discuss. I just kind of listed 3 of the most common, and these are these PSP, create process, notify routine, create thread, and load image, right? Again, these are heavily scrutinized for process injection and identifying remote code execution in another process. So the kernel driver publishes or subscribes to these callbacks, and then whenever a process is created, a thread is created, or an image is loaded, and again, by image, we mean an exe or a DLL, the EDR kernel driver gets notified about that with, the path, the PID, sort of everything it needs to go ahead and further scrutinize that behavior. You can use a tool such as Telemetry Sorcerer by Jackson T to enumerate a list of kernel callbacks that EDRs or other drivers subscribe to. Here's some sample callback routines present in one of the CrowdStrike drivers, CS Agent. And at the top, you'll see here, there is a create named pipe callback, and this is pretty popular to monitor because C2 frameworks such as Cobalt Strike, which is commonly abused by ransomware teams, will use named pipes to perform communication over SMB, to other local machines on the network or just child beacons. So, you see a ton of other stuff in here as well. And this is not an inclusive screenshot of everything that the CrowdStrike EDR driver subscribes to, but just some examples of how you can see that information. And if you can understand what they subscribe to and what they're doing, you can further research tactics and techniques that you might be able to get around or manipulate some of those. One example of evading a kernel image load callback is this library called Dark Load Library, which was made by a security researcher by the alias BATSEC. He works for MDSEC. And he figured out, that by looking into this PSP load image notify routine, that ultimately it was the NT map view of section call that set up the module's memory inside of the Windows loader that triggers the callback, right? So he asked himself, how can I load a library or load an image without triggering the callback of this notify routine? And his solution was to implement an entire replica of the Windows loader from scratch, which doesn't rely on that built-in Windows loader functionality to set up the module's memory. And by using this library, which is publicly available on GitHub, you can have a lot of success loading images without triggering those certain callback routines. So again, just underlines the importance of why EDRs get the same data and same telemetry from as many sources as they can, because they know that they can be blinded by one and may not be able to detect it. So that's an example of bypassing a kernel callback routine. And another detection mechanism is the use of user mode API hooking. So this is normally pretty trivially bypassed, but many EDR products choose to implement forms of user mode API hooking to collect even more telemetry on a process's behavior. Again, the downside of user mode level analysis is that it can be manipulated or bypassed or even spoofed by the user mode process itself, which is why EDR products won't just rely on this one source for the type of telemetry if they can help it. And when you start a process on Windows, a lot of core DLLs are loaded that contain a variety of Windows API calls that the process needs to set up and run. And two of those DLLs that are always loaded when a new process is spawned is NTDLL and kernel 32. EDRs that implement user mode hooking will also load their own DLL into that process space whenever it's spawned. And you can kind of Google online and get a list of what the DLLs are named and what vendor they map to, and look in a tool like Process Hacker to identify if your EDR is doing that same behavior. But after the EDR loads its DLL into the process, it will look at NTDLL and kernel 32 DLL, among others, and place hooks on top of certain API calls within those DLLs. And we'll break that down a bit in the next couple slides, but ultimately, when you have your user code here and you call a function such as read file, it may pass through an abstraction layer in kernel 32, but ultimately it calls the NT API and NTDLL, which is NT read file. And a user mode process requesting the contents of a file has to pass into the kernel, right? So a variety of checks can be ran, low-level calls can be executed and such. So NTDLL does this. It passes from the user mode to kernel with what's known as a syscall. And that's just requesting information or tasks from the kernel and then returning the results back into user mode. So it's a boundary there for security. And kind of the flow of what's going on here. Again, when we spawn that new process, right, you're getting the Windows DLLs, but you're also getting that EDR DLL. And as soon as that DLL gets loaded, it starts to hook APIs within NTDLL or others, and then redirect them to another function within itself so it can analyze it. So say your process is trying to perform code injection and it calls create thread. Create thread ultimately, at the end of the day, calls NT create thread or NT create thread EX, which is present in NTDLL. And NT create thread is a low-level API that's usually invoked when we're performing some sort of remote code execution or injection rather. And so EDR products would want to hook this API so they can look at everything that's calling it and what's going into it, what the arguments are, etc. So your process calls create thread, eventually that calls NT create thread, and NT create thread is hooked, right? So you think you're calling it an NTDLL, but you're really being redirected to the EDR's DLL. And the EDR will look at the arguments that are passed to that function and scan them for malicious behavior or IOCs. And then it will forward that intercepted call to the real call in NTDLL, which gets returned back to your process. So your original process doesn't really have any idea that its code passed through a hook. And usually it will receive the expected results back unless the EDR decides to block something or terminate it. And API hooking is performed by modifying some of the bytes in the original NTDLL, redirecting those functions to another address within the EDR's DLL, usually with an assembly JMP or jump instruction there. There's three primary ways to bypass the user mode hooking. So the first and most straightforward is to simply load another clean copy of NTDLL or whatever other DLL you want from disk into your process memory space. So your process spawned, it already has NTDLL in memory, and within the text section, are the contents that the EDR DLL has manipulated or hooked to redirect traffic through their own DLL. So you can just read NTDLL off disk, map it into memory, find the virtual address of that clean text section, find the virtual address of the hooked text section, and copy the clean one over the hooked one, and then apply and fix your memory protections, and then just start calling API functions as normal. and nothing will pass through the EDR DLL because you've totally overwritten and replaced, any of those modified bytes that would have been hooked. The second method is kind of like that, but it involves manually checking functions within NTDLL for the presence of a hook, or just, going through and manipulating a list of API functions that you want to make sure are not hooked. And this technique is not as widely used because different EDR vendors will hook different API functions, and it's generally much easier to reload the entire hook DLL text section to just ensure that everything's completely removed. But you see here we have another flow chart, right? You call create remote thread. Create remote thread is in kernel 32. So you could hook create remote thread in kernel 32, or again, you could hook nt create thread in ntdll, which is what most of them will do, because at the end of the day, kernel 32's create remote thread is just an abstraction wrapper around nt create thread, which is called at the very end of it. So typically, EDR vendors will focus on NTDLL because a lot of calls from the other DLLs are just abstractions that trickle down to NT. So here you see in this case, the hook is right here. There's a jump instruction to the EDR's DLL to go to this function, inspect other instructions, right? And so you call create remote thread. It thinks it's calling it from kernel 32. It jumps to an address in the EDR's DLL where you have your hooked create remote thread. The arguments are checked, and then the EDR DLL says, hey, let's jump back to the real kernel 32 DLL and continue, and then it gets returned. So, your process is none the wiser, and some ways you can just blanket remove certain hooks is by getting the process address of the function you want to make sure is unhooked, which in this case, here's an example for Cylance. You could get the proc address of create remote thread within the kernel 32 DLL, update the memory protection so it's RWX, read, write, and executable. And then you can copy over bytes to patch or remove that hook or restore it to its original condition, then restore your memory pages. And from there, when you call create remote thread, it's going to go right to kernel 32, and this jump instruction will no longer be there. So a little bit more involved and complicated than just blanket reloading the DLL, but you do see that used quite a bit.
Hey, Adam, just a friendly reminder, we got about 9 minutes left.
Okay. All right. Yep. I will speed up here on some of these other ones. So another way to bypass the hooking is by using SYSCALLS. And so, when you call an API from kernel 32, it ultimately trickles down to NTDLL, which makes that syscall that transitions the boundary between user land and kernel land, and then gets the results back, right? So it's possible just to not use any of these API abstractions in kernel 32 or NTDLL and just have your program make the syscall directly. And that works just fine. It can be kind of an inconvenience because certain versions of Windows change those syscall values. And there's a lot of tools and frameworks like syswhispers that will help you automate that and get around that. But direct syscalls are kind of a big red flag because security products can just look and see if your binary is initiating a syscall directly, which is very uncommon behavior and pretty much almost always malicious behavior because there's not really any reason to not use the abstractions up here so that your syscall comes from NTDLL. But if you do make the direct syscall yourself, you obviously bypass any of these APIs up here that may have been hooked, right? So you kind of sneak right on by. One of the better methods is indirect syscalls. So again, the problem with a direct syscall is that your program is making the syscall, it goes right to the kernel, and then the RIP, the instruction pointer, is pointing back to your program when it returns. And EDRs can look and see what the RIP is on a syscall, and if it's not coming from NTDLL, which it almost always should be, then they know it, it could be malicious or it's a direct syscall. So indirect syscalls bypass this RIP check and this type of detection by performing a jump to the code within NTDLL, then doing the syscall by dynamically resolving that address and jumping to it. So you can make a syscall, but it will come from NTDLL. And so it looks legitimate, but you still don't pass through these abstraction layers here. And at the end of the day, it kind of underlines the importance that installing EDR isn't enough by itself. A successful implementation is very reliant on also having threat hunters or somebody, some sort of managed provider combing through that collected telemetry to identify the detections and alerts that the out-of-the-box stuff has missed. And the out-of-the-box detections are really designed to have a low false positive rate, so they have certain blind spots that can be manipulated by bad actors. Kind of a bullet point here to go by, right? EDRs give you a wealth of telemetry, and that telemetry is designed to be consumed by analysts, threat hunters, or incident responders to proactively and retroactively augment your security prowess. So just having that EDR installed is, obviously going to help you quite a bit, but without eyes on that telemetry and some sort of managed scrutiny and threat hunting, you can really miss a lot of things, right?
Yeah, that's excellent, Adam. And that's really getting back to that whole issue with staffing, right?
Yeah. A lot of those EDR products were great. Personally, I'm a pretty big fan of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and SentinelOne. But at the end of the day, we kind of decided to build something out of what we found from those products. And what we settled on is an offering that I would hope to see us launch soon. I think we're looking at sometime this October. And it's called EAGLESEC Managed EDR. And the product that we chose to go with is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint because of the extensive amount of telemetry it collects, but also because of the flexibility of its query language. It has, in my opinion, some of the best threat hunting capabilities that are out there in an EDR right now. And when you couple that with the Microsoft telemetry of global prevalence and files and all the data that they're ingesting from organizations, you get a pretty solid threat hunting piece that you can leverage.
Yeah, and Adam, aren't we always typically shocked by how many people own this and just haven't been able to leverage it due to their Microsoft licensing?
Yep. Yeah, you see that quite a bit. A lot of people, I think most environments we work with are probably hybrid on-prem and 365. And so you may already have Defender for Endpoint or some sort of Defender plan. And the plan that we focus on is the Defender for Business plan, which is a pretty new offering. I think it hasn't even been out for a year. But it's Microsoft's Defender that's targeted at smaller businesses. So I think around 300 endpoints or so. Naturally, we can do any plan and scale that up, right? We support any type of Defender plan there. But we're targeting that Defender for Business plan 2 because plan 2 gives you that telemetry and threat hunting piece that the default plan does not give you. And if you're going to deploy an EDR product, one of the main points, again, of EDR is to collect that telemetry so you can proactively detect threats, but also, in the case of an attack, give your incident responders as much forensics data to work with. So you have a successful IR scenario and you can trace back where the breach came from and patch the holes so it doesn't just happen again after you recover. So the onboarding process that we've built, revolves around deploying that Defender product and then continuous and automatic device discovery and enrollment. So as you add new devices within your network or employees bring new devices in or they join them to the domain, they get automatically installed, Defender's automatically installed and deployed, and the policies are set appropriately. So that also incorporates some of the MEM or Intune device management, working on dynamic groups and policy application. You might have, some software developers in your environment that need to load unsigned DLLs, for example, that could be allowed by a dynamic group or specific policy, whereas, your front-end users or sales team, for example, if they ever run an application that loads an unsigned DLL, that should probably be a red flag. So things like that, curating it towards your organization with that dynamic group config, and then building and deploying a security baseline policy for the initial onboarding while working towards constructing a pathway that helps you further restrict that and improve your security posture while trying to reduce the impact to business there. And the base offerings within this product are, of course, the typical offerings you get from any MDR are the threat alerts, email or phone, and the customized reporting. But the piece that we really focus on is the threat hunting. So daily or even more frequent, sometimes hourly, queries that we run for known indicators of compromise, reviewing those tactic or technique timelines and scrutinizing process creation and process child relationships, querying for those persistence indicators like auto runs or scheduled tasks, looking at really common malware threats that are out today, especially in phishing campaigns, and getting those hashes and IOCs, and then retroactively looking at the environment to see if anything within your environment has executed that matches one of those IOCs. And then also supporting curated organizational monitoring rules, right? Like say you have a group of servers that you don't allow outbound internet access from, and you want to keep an eye on that, we can curate a query that checks those daily and notifies you if any sort of outbound connection attempt was made from that machine and what process originated that attempt, things like that. So you can get really custom with how you query those. And then the response piece, we can kind of assist with that initial forensics collection. So taking a snapshot, preserving the volatile memory, snapping the disk, and then using tools like CAPE and some of the other Eric Zimmerman tools to perform and collect a sort of initial forensics bundle. And we can share that extensive and detailed telemetry with you and collaborate with any sort of IR teams or IR retainer providers that you may already have. And there's some bolt-on services that we do offer. Some of these aren't, they don't require the managed EDR product. Some of them, probably won't work without it. But, two examples of things we do right now, penetration testing and external vulnerability scan and exposure. Obviously, that doesn't require, managed EDR. We're looking at rolling out an Azure security hardening assessment where we can help you deploy things like conditional access policies, which will help you restrict what users, what devices, what geographical locations, etc., are allowed to authenticate to or access certain resources. And going over what app permissions you may have, who you're sharing data with, and what the impact of that might be, as well as the usual, trying to enforce MFA, looking at disabling some older protocols, especially when you look at Exchange in 365. It's important to disable some older protocols that might allow bad actors to bypass MFA when they do some password brute forcing attacks or credential spraying. And then an on-premise Active Directory security assessment. This is included within the penetration testing piece right now, but we're working on kind of breaking that out and making it an individual offering if you would like to consume that separately. And then helping you with any sort of third-party SIEM integration. If you already have Elastic or Splunk or something on site, we can help you dump that data that we collect from Defender for Endpoint into your SIEM. So you can do in-house threat hunting on that, as well as curated security policy creation. Kind of touched on that before, but do we need to block certain internet access on machines, block USB devices? Do you want to restrict a machine to only run signed executables by Microsoft apps only, things like that? And then further, hope to offer education and training around cybersecurity offerings in general, as well as focusing on Azure and Defender for Endpoint. So that was just kind of a quick teaser of this managed EDR offering that we're looking at, and we're going to have a lot more to show in the near future.